All right, so let's get into some of the conditions that Americans dealt with during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So to kind of wrap up our causes of the Depression, we have, of course, the Federal Reserve action taken only a few months before the actual October Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday fiasco in 1929. In August, this is just a couple weeks before the markets end up crashing at the end of October, the Federal Reserve Bank was kind of worried about the over-speculation. They were worried about how many people were investing for that margin 10% purchasing power, and they didn't really like it. They also didn't like the amount of credit that was presumed by some of the figures that were coming in from different larger banks. So they decided to take the interest rate that's 5% in August 1929 and raise it a whole 1% to 6%. Now, of course, that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but keep in mind that today, when this is recorded in 2020, the interest rate fluctuates between 0 to sometimes 0.5 at most in most of the 21st century. And so we're looking at a 5% rate. What that means is the Federal Reserve, that's our central bank in the United States, it is going to loan money to its regional banks, and then it goes down from there into the other private and so on and so forth banks. And the initial interest rate is 5%. And now, as of August 1929, that was raised to 6%. Just a matter of weeks before the October fiascos in the stock market. So a lot of people take a look at that, and they wonder, why? And, it's well-intentioned, but also kind of myopic. And luckily the Federal Reserve tends to learn a lot from its own lessons and respond well to kind of combating inflation, but also combating too much credit capability as well inside our central banking system. Now, President Hoover, who wins the election in 1928, and of course is sworn in January 1929, so he's there at the very beginning of the Great Depression. Don't forget about Hoover and what he did and maybe what he didn't do well enough and not enough of in the early years of the Depression. Hoover gives this speech when he's trying to differentiate himself from his competitor in the Democrat Party, and he ends up calling his new philosophy, or at least his philosophy that he says he's had, as rugged individualism. And again, it's well-intentioned. Don't think so bad of Republicans in the 1920s just because they get a bad stigma. What we have here is, I think, a pretty well-rounded idea of American patriotism, of self-reliance, of economic independence, of pushing yourself to do more and try as much as you can, to adopt enterprise, and to be a volunteer inside the system and the society that you live in. Some of the key points from Hoover are going to be that individual freedom. Now, Hoover is going to argue that you look at the European countries especially, and then the Soviet Union as it was in the 1920s, you see that these great countries of old have deteriorated into a state of pretty rough times. And if you know much on world history, the 1920s and 30s globally is this move towards totalitarian regimes in the major countries of the world. And what he's looking at is that we have this issue that these countries are centralizing their government. They're embracing state socialism. They're embracing doctrines that are opposed to those of the American core values of figuring things out, and anyone can be successful if they work hard enough, and other motifs like that. So he looks at the other system and he says that part of his rugged individualism and what most Americans like and should embrace is this idea that you can do whatever you need to as long as government stays out of the way. So it's not as if he's out here saying these outlandish things, but looking back at it, it's kind of popular to hear that kind of message from a president to be, but it's also a little disturbing looking back as a historian, because we realize that the writing was on the wall. There are plenty of warning signs that not just a stock crash was coming, but also that there's a lot of serious problems under the surface of what looks like an awesome time in the 1920s. Secondly, in his rugged individualism, Hoover wanted to actually find a way to continue to embrace this upward movement that he saw in the marketplace for social classes, meaning he wants to really minimize and maybe even eliminate poverty. That's awesome. If you know much on American history, President Lyndon Johnson in the 70s and 60s would actually also embrace that idea of trying to end poverty because they had seen some of the worst of it. In the American experiment, Hoover says, human welfare has yielded a degree of well-being not yet seen by other countries in the world. What he's trying to say is that even the poorest of American society is doing a lot better than the poor of other societies. And that's fair to a point, and it's fair even in today's world as well. But it's fascinating that we have so many in poverty in the wealthiest country in the world, and they can't by any means seem to afford to actually live in the richest country in the world. So yeah, there's two faces to this coin, and it's kind of interesting that he only looks at that purely embracing of freedom and eliminating poverty because statistically things look good on the stock market. Statistically things look good in the workplace. Everyone's working. Okay. There are other ways to measure economic success, however. So what we see during Hoover's administration, especially very short after the October fiascos, is 100,000, possibly even more businesses completely fail in the United States. And they're not just localized to large cities and suburbs, they're throughout the country. These are entrepreneurial businesses even that falter and fail outrightly and declare bankruptcy, and they're gone. We see about half of the nation's banks completely fail, and these bank runs that end up happening in the early Great Depression, people are going there and hoping to remove their savings and get some hard currency out. And in some cases, people actually start to accept different county bosses and others who do have wealth to purchase receipts from the banks for pennies on the dollar, meaning I may have say a $300 savings account, which back then was a decent amount of money. And because the bank can actually honor that $300 for say 3+ months, I'm going to go to a county boss or someone who has some wealth, and I'm going to issue them my receipt, send it over to them, say now they hold this amount of money on this paper, and they're going to give me hard currency cash. So I have some fiat currency now. I have maybe say $50, not nearly as much as I had. And a lot of cases, as things get much worse and much more drastic and desperate, people start taking almost essentially pennies on the dollar for their investments, because when you look at it, anything's better than nothing. So it's a rough moment. We see at the height in 1932 and 33, 25% unemployment numbers. And that's something unheard of by 21st century standards, except during parts of the COVID-19 crisis in 2020 when this was filmed. We also see a rise of folks using essentially cardboard boxes and scrap wood and scrap metal and whatnot, whatever they can, but mostly cardboard, and building these homeless suburb towns, right outside of cities, because there's this mass exodus of people who can no longer afford the rent. And I mean, let's face it, a bank, if it can foreclose on you or evict you or just kick you out of your apartment, well, they're going to do that because they look after themselves too. And banks are in a pretty rough moment as well. So they're going to honor what's best for them and take care of their own needs first. So with all these homeless, we start seeing these shanty towns pop up outside cities and become affectionately known, named after the President Herbert Hoover, as Hoovervilles. And then we see folks who have at least paid off a car or are just going to steal the car and not pay off the rest of it to the bank. They can't really afford the gasoline anymore or the oil for it, so they're going to go on and attach a horse and buggy to it. And they call these Hoover wagons, and this happens a lot more than you would think. And then we have folks who would actually walk around completely penniless, and even with their kids in tow with them, begging for $1, begging for some coins here or there, and they call the pockets of these completely impoverished folks pulled out. as Hoover flags, which tend to be white, like they're surrendering. Now, under Hoover's rugged individualism, he really didn't want to have government interference. Keep that in mind. But he's going to kind of change his mind later on. Hoover is one of those guys, I think, who he actually has well-intentioned and well-founded ideas and what he thinks is the best solution. For instance, he wants the economy to fix itself through businesses, through associations, what we call associationalism. And that's all fine and dandy. The idea of getting large businesses or even small businesses to work with local farmers, to work with local banks, to raise wages of the working class so that they actually have money to pay for this, to convince farmers in certain areas to produce less so that crop prices come up and the new higher wages can afford to buy those. And banks are like, instead of having to deal with all these eviction paperwork and foreclosure paperwork, now maybe you actually restructure people's loans and allow them to stay in, and you just make them pay for it longer, but at less per month. He kind of hoped that these associations of businesses in different sectors of the economy would work together. I mean, even labor unions were attached to a lot of the associations. And it's all nice on the surface, and it's all well-intentioned again, but it doesn't work that way. It really doesn't. Humans are greedy, if nothing else. So when you look at businesses who worry about their bottom line, when you look at farmers who are legitimately freaked out and like, well, why would you want me to produce less? Like, that don't make sense to me. And then when you look at labor unions who are trying to get businesses to adopt better, safer practices so people aren't getting hurt because they can't afford medical issues right now, none of that comes together and works. It's well-intentioned again, but it doesn't work. So Hoover starts to see the writing on the wall a little late, and a lot of the country is kind of fed up with that. And it really comes to a head in 1932 during the election circuit. We have World War I veterans who march together on Washington, D.C., and they actually pitch a camp out in Washington, D.C. as well, with inside of the White House. And the interesting part that goes on here is Hoover's like, man, I don't want that being seen in Washington, D.C. We're supposed to be a country that's on the move, that's doing X, Y, and Z. We're rugged. We're awesome. We're doing all this great stuff. We're going to beat the Depression before other countries can beat it with their nonsensical ways of totalitarianism and communalism. Well, he orders General MacArthur, a to-be American hero, and by all means at this point already pretty well known from World War I as well, to go out there and burn the tents and get rid of the World War I veterans. Now, legally, the bonuses that were promised to the World War I veterans were not supposed to come due until the 1940s. So, yeah, they were asking for it early. Yes, they were. But I suspect they probably would have been okay with taking a portion of that bonus for their combat service. Nonetheless, they're pushed out of Washington, D.C. And I can just see it in my mind's eye to be President Franklin Delano Roosevelt looking at the news of the bonus army march and the burning of the camp and just thinking to himself, what a fool. Hoover has essentially given me, FDR, the win to this election. And FDR is going to embrace a much more aggressive, much more a willing approach to work with Congress and push bills through, to push a lot of initiatives through. We call a lot of the things that he pushes through the alphabet soup of the New Deals. And it's properly written so, because I think if you take nothing else from the New Deal that we're about to talk about, it was a moment in time to where the country was collectively so desperate that we're clinging for hope, we're clinging for government to get involved with things, to end this idea of rugged individualism and get the government even more involved in our everyday lives and the economy, that we're actually willing to give up some freedoms. And for better or for worse, it happened. But it's also such a desperate moment that people are okay with it. And maybe it had to happen. Now, you be the judge of it based on your own research. But let's take a look at it in the next episode of how much does the New Deal actually help improve things? Or does it just maintain a level of somewhat success and keep the country flatline for a while? Because I think everyone can agree it's really the wartime spending and the mass production and having markets again of World War II and what comes after World War II with the Marshall Plan that really ends the moment of the Great Depression.